So again, I'm Megan Dwyer. I'm on staff with Illinois Corn. We have Matt Herman on staff with with Iowa soybeans this morning. Very fortunate to have Matt. He's got a deep background in this space around the biofuels, around carbon intensity, what we can do to reduce our footprint. I serve as the Director of Conservation and Nutrient Stewardship, handle a lot of the water quality issues here at Corn. And as we think about these climate smart practices and how they tie into some of these new rulemakings around biofuels is how I get brought into this. So this morning, we're going to talk to you both about a CI, what a carbon intensity score is, how that's calculated, what that means, as well as what we know and what we don't know on 45Z. And again, with having Matt on, we're really lucky. You're going to get both a corn and a soybean perspective here. So with that, Matt, have you got anything you'd like to share as I'll get the slides loaded up here?
No, just good morning, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to join you. I've had a few opportunities to work with Dave and Colin and other members of Illinois Corn throughout the year. You've got a great team on biofuels. Megan, you got the slides pulled up, but it looks like we're seeing the presenter side. There you go. Perfect.
Pretty good. Okay, great. Maybe if I can get them to advance now. All right. Well, we will kick things off with the carbon intensity score. And so with this too, really our intent of today's webinar is to walk you guys through it. We know that you're being asked about signing up for some programs, asking to have your score calculated. We also know we've got a wide audience on this morning. We've got some farmers, we've got some industry folks. We are going to try and keep this fairly high level. Illinois Corn does plan to have subsequent webinars that maybe take some of these topics a little bit deeper. So there will be some technical information shared, but really just want to try and give you some confidence, knowing that your associations, your checkoffs have been hard at work, both meeting with the regulatory offices, agency officials, and the private side to try and help figure out where we stand today. So a CI score really is your carbon intensity score, and it's looking at your GHG, your greenhouse gas emissions footprint, and it's all related to the amount of energy being created. One thing to note is the slide today, you're going to see we're talking about units of CO2 equivalent, or GHG per megajoule. Some of the 45Z rule, it's being expressed in kilograms per million BTU. That is something, as you're kind of wading through information that's out there, making sure that you are comparing apples to apples and knowing that some of those units can change. So when we're thinking about a score, it's like golf. We want a lower score. The lower score is more favorable, and that's just attributing that you have a reduced footprint, that you're using less energy, less carbon is being emitted in your production and in the life cycle that's being assessed. We support, there's lots of models that exist today. We know that there's the Corsia model, there's the GREET model, Comet model, there's all sorts of models out there that can quantify and look at what this means. As it relates to things today and kind of where we've been for advocating, really supporting the Argonne National Laboratory, which is located in Illinois, their GREET model. So that's something I think a lot of you may be hearing when we talk about these things, but the GREET model is what we're interested in, and then to pair that up with the FDCIC calculator. And this calculator, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it is publicly available. You can go to the website today, download an Excel file, and plug and play for your own farm and field, and calculate a score on your own computer right from the comfort of your own home. As we start thinking about what's going to come in some of these proposed rules and what we mean and what those reductions look like. So just to set the stage a little bit, and these are just rough numbers, but to give you an idea, nationally petroleum is around 197 the grams of CO2 equivalent. Currently, the ethanol industry, ethanol to jet, is about 60, and nationally corn is around 29. So for you on your farms, when you start having these conversations and they're talking to you, a lot of times people are using that 29 as a baseline and hoping that some of these practices and decisions you make on your own farm can reduce that score under that level. So how this is calculated, a little bit, I try to throw some visuals in here, and this is coming right out of that FDCIC calculator user manual. For the purpose of this, we're really going to kind of focus on box number 1. As you can see, as you go through, box number 2, there's again those differences in those units and what we're talking about. Differences there that the material CI, an energy CI score is really looking at the emissions associated with the producing and distributing, consuming the material. Your material CI is looking at that carbon footprint of a product or bushel of grain. So again, just making sure if you're having conversations or reviewing contracts or reviewing things, you are watching what those units are and understanding that. So for the purpose, again, on box number 1, these inputs, crop yield is a primary driver. So if we think about two sides of this, yield is extremely important on the one side of this equation, and it's really going to impact what your outcome and what your deliverable of a CI score is. On the other side of that equation, you're thinking about your inputs and the decisions you're going to make. So things around, and for corn specifically, your commercial nitrogen is your number 1 driver. So if you can reduce your nitrogen usage, if you can switch to something like a manure source, we saw, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, in the 40B guidance, enhanced efficiency fertilizers, which were pretty much defined as stabilizers. So that was an impact. And then thinking about additional practices that you're doing. So this is where your tillage decisions come into play. If you're using a cover crop, if you are, potentially if you have on-farm energy generation, clean energy, solar, using biodiesel as your diesel source, any of those energy inputs, things even as simple as your line choices can play and have an impact in your CI score. So really it's looking holistically at all the decisions you're making and everything that you're doing. There's also this SCO, the soil organic carbon. And so that's there are some charts available today, some data that's out there that has these values assigned based on your geography and some assumptions on your soil characteristics and properties. So when you put all of that together, it produces you a nice number, your CI score. And I mentioned earlier that if you're interested, you can do this right here at home. Down at the bottom of the screen right now, going to Greet, you can pull up and again download and play around and make a lot of these assumptions and see what different scenarios could do and make some changes to your own farm and field level operations. One thing that I do want to note here, so again, I mentioned that our associations have had a seat at the table for you having a lot of these conversations. And I do think it's important that as of today, Argonne has not issued any commercial licensing for their FDCIC calculator to be used. It is publicly available for people to access, but that commercial license has yet to be given to anyone. So switching gears and why this matters and how this CI score that everyone's talking about is going to make a difference or be incorporated with 45Z. We're going to talk about 45Z. We're also going to have some references to what's called 40B. And that is because there was a rule, 40B, and it's in place for the 2023 and 2024 years. The official rules and guidance for that came out the end of April 30th of 2024. So that kind of also gives you an idea of what to expect on getting final guidance and rules on some of these tax credits, as it takes time. So when we saw 40B, that really for us was kind of an inside look at what we think might be coming out of 45Z, the things we really need to be thinking about, advocating, and positioning. So I know in Matt's slides, we're going to see a little bit deeper on 40B, and that's just because we actually know what is in those rules, and that gives us a better availability to really discuss and dissect these rules. We also know that we talked about the score, the CI calculator in the GREET model and the FDCIC calculator. We know in 45Z, there will be a new 45Z GREET that comes out. So there will be some tweaks, some changes. So while you can go out and get a CI score today, I would caution you that that is probably not going to be your exact score in a 45Z rule. Do I think you're going to have a major swing? No, but I would caution you that that number is most likely to change in the final rules of 45Z. So 45Z, Again, this is something that was issued in the Inflation Reduction Act. So the rules that came out there, and it's important to note that this is a tax credit that is available to the producer of the low carbon fuels, including SAF. So this is going directly to your ethanol, your biodiesel producer. It is not a tax credit going to the farmer. A farmer would, in theory, receive some sort of incentive then from that biofuels producer. In order for them to qualify and be able to take advantage of this tax credit, they must achieve a 50% reduction of their CI score compared to petroleum. So if you think back a couple slides when we said petroleum's roughly at 100 for even math here, your biofuel is going to have to get below a 50. And so that's also, I think there's some confusion. We talk about 50, well, is it 50% or 50 points? And again, those numbers can get a little confusing. So again, units and those things really matter on this. Now they can also, so 50% reduction puts them in the money, if you will. There are additional incentives if they can get that reduction beyond a 50%. And so, you know, these plants are going to be looking at ways to fully maximize their ability to capitalize on these tax credits and investments. This does go into effect January 1st, 2025, which is why we are very interested and excited about this. But as I mentioned with 40B, while that was in place, we didn't see final rules until after that had started. I can tell you that I was in DC last week meeting with Treasury, USDA, and we had staff with Department of Energy. Matt's heading out to DC next week. I would say that they're very shy to give any official timeline, noting that they really have until the end of December to issue the draft rule. There'll be a draft rule that's issued, they'll be open for public comments, and a final rule will be shaped from that. Now, there has been work being done. USDA has kind of interjected themselves with Treasury and had opened up a comment period on a request for information. And they had 20 some questions that they were really interested in knowing. Both of our associations submitted comments and have been working through the things. And those are things they're curious about. What type of climate smart practices should be eligible and worked in a rule like this? How should the accounting of the grain work? How should we make sure that there's not fraud and the system's not being manipulated? What about the modeling and the verification and the data needs? So they're really trying to look at this, and it's really like trying to eat an elephant, and they're trying to figure out the best way to make this work for everyone. Now, knowing that this starts January 1 of 25, currently it is set to sunset the end of 2027. So it is a relatively short tax credit. There's a lot of people interested today in seeing that extended and knowing what this can mean for the industry. And so that is, again, to be determined. But as it's today, it's a 3-year tax credit, which we all know is from the purpose of growing corn and soybeans. You know, the 24 crops in the bag, we've already made all of those decisions. We're starting to harvest today. Really, by the time we see even draft rules, I would say a lot of the decisions for the 25 crop have been made. If you're going to have a cover crop in, your fall tillage, fall nitrogen, all of those decisions are going to be made. So really, I see an impact to really make an influence on acres is going to be 26. Again, knowing that this is a tax credit, it means that we're going to have to get to the end of a tax year, end of that fiscal year for these biofuels producers. So in theory, if things kick off and a farmer is positioned with their 24 crop and it gets sold in 2025 and is eligible for this market, one would assume that when the books close at the end of 25 and the ethanol plant is able to see, did they have the gallons that met the reduction requirements? Did they have a tax liability? What was that tax liability? They receive that tax credit. Potentially sometime in 2026 is when a farmer might see some of that flow through. So just keeping that in mind as well on what this looks like and what is actually possible given what we know and how this is set up to work. And Matt's going to really dive into this tax credit thing for us in just a little bit. So why do we care? Again, this is a 3-year tax credit. This is going through Treasury. What's the big deal? I would say for Illinois farmers and really anyone in the I-states and where we have the capacity to produce ethanol, it's a big driver. We know we're sitting on some some carryover. We know that there's some pretty good yields coming. We need to find a way to use our commodity. We need to find a way to use corn. So in Illinois, we have 14 ethanol plants with about just under 2 billion gallon capacity. This is using about 30% of Illinois corn today. The chart you see below is what our current administration is challenging us with for some of this sustainable aviation fuel. I also think in Illinois, we are looking at Chicago. We've got O'Hare. We've got a lot of airlines that could take advantage of this product. So we want to be positioned to make sure we can meet the demands and be that feedstock going into this. So this is where the administration would like us to go. This is kind of setting the stage for where this production is, where it's projected to be over the next few years. You can see at the bottom, I won't bore you by reading that, but this is just kind of looking at the facilities that are set up today and projected to be in play over the next decade or so. So you can see the green bar there that's not part of the top 220 million bushels is really looking at Green Diamond. This is a Texas facility and it's all lipid based. So tallows, used cooking oil, soybean oil is what that facility is. And it's projected to go online fourth quarter of this year. We move up and look at, the GEVO. This is a South Dakota facility. So it's that solid yellow bar here. The hope is that could potentially be in play for 2025. Really some of that is going to be dependent on the Summit pipeline and their capacity on carbon capture up there. And then looking into Marquis and LanzaJet's relationship, there was a 2022 press release around that. So they've been thinking about this for quite a while and being very strategic in their position. And then moving on into a GEVO second phase, which is potentially maybe somewhere in central Illinois, but all to be determined. So this is just showing that we've got today this kind of 3-year tax credit is just one piece of the pie. There's tax credits around carbon capture for these facilities, but a lot of these plants are trying to play the long game and be strategic and look at ramping up production and trying to be in a position to take advantage of this and then have a product to be in the market. So here's really what you guys care about. What do we know? Oops, and I have a typo. 43Z should definitely be 45Z, so I apologize for that. So honestly, to date, we don't know very much with a high degree of certainty. And so that's where I think there's a lot of caution that needs to be in place on making sure you're not overcommitting yourself or getting in a position that you become uncomfortable in. As we mentioned, the draft rules still haven't even been issued. We do think they'll be out they need to be out sometime by the end of the year. There will be a pretty brief public comment period, we would assume, to turn that around. Mentioned that the FDCIC calculator will be updated. So your CI score, again, if you have one today, is most likely going to change a little bit. We talked about 40B as kind of some of those early signals in what we were looking at. And that's where, as well, we had the bundling of products. You had practices. You had to do 3 practices on corn, 2 on soybeans. And so, thinking about what will that look like in 45Z? We know there's lots of early players trying to secure their base today. So again, whether that's trying to get you to commit to a CI score, commit to some sort of agreement, those that are going to need the corn, going to need a low CI feedstock, are wanting to make sure that their investments, they also have that supply of a low CI feedstock on the back end. So, they need to be positioning themselves as well. It's just making sure that everybody is going about this in a way to make sure that both parties are protected and have the best interest, they're both interests in mind. So here are the things to be thinking about and what we are talking about and advocating for and big questions in our mind. So with climate smart practices, first of all, which practices? We know in 40B, it was limited to 3. It was tillage, cover crops, and enhanced efficiency fertilizer on corn, tillage, and cover crops and soybeans. We're advocating that the FDCIC calculator has a whole bundle and suite of practices that you can use in calculating that score. We think those all should be considered. We also think that individual practices without bundling them should be considered. Now, however, if you can prove scientifically that if you do multiple practices, that you see an even greater reduction to your CI score, then obviously we should take advantage of that. But we should not be holding farmers responsible for doing multiple things tied together. Definitions. This is a big one that's had me hung up. In 40B, it was written that you had to do practices according to NRCS practice standards. So to me, words matter. There are NRCS definitions, and then the next level are NRCS practice standards. The practice standards are the very specific things that tell you exactly how many pounds of seed you need to plant per acre, what you're planting, termination, all of those things are. And so that we think is really restrictive to a farmer. We know that some of those things can be more cost prohibitive. We know that they might not make as much sense on your particular field. And so it really limits the innovation that exists today. And so we are advocating that we do not have practice standards tied to practices in 45Z. And then permanency. There was a permanency clause in 40B. On the tillage piece, you were asked to not basically do tillage for up to 10 years, knowing this is an annual tax credit. That's a problem. We know that for the modeling purposes and to have a true reduction, that there is a play for permanency. The longer that you do these practices, you capture that carbon, you reduce that carbon, that some things, if you go out and till, then some of that's released back into the atmosphere and you're undoing what you've done. However, for the instance of an annual tax credit, we want to be very cautious that we're not tying farmers into making very long perpetual commitments for an annual incentive. Systems of accounting. This is a big one that's being talked about a lot. And really there's other options out there, things like segregation, identity preservation. But the two that have really floated through the top are mass balance and book and claim. Mass balance would be that the asset, your climate smart practices are tied to your bushel of grain, and it stays with that bushel as it moves through the system. Book and claim, you decouple, you separate that. So now yellow number 2 corn is yellow number 2 corn that flows through the system. You have generated a token, certificate, whatever you want to call it, that is associated with a number of bushels for that climate smart practice, that CI score value. Why this is important? There's a lot of reasons. The first being mass balance has to have a point of mass balance. This is something that USDA, Treasury, nobody has been able to define on where that point of mass balance would exist. Prior to that point, you would need to have your grain segregated. So if you had bushels of 11 CI corn and bushels of 25 CI corn, until that point of mass balance existed, you would need to have those separate. That can be a problem. Moving to book and claim, the reasons that we are advocating for book and claim, one, the transparency. We think if we can separate that asset out, there's a better chance of you, the farmer, having an idea of what that is worth. What are your practices, your time, your management changes worth on implementing these differences, these changes? Allowing more farmers to participate, right? We know ethanols have a pretty limited draw region. We're not typically going to be pulling corn in from hundreds of miles away. So if we separate this out, it allows more farmers the access and ability to participate. In theory, you could have ethanol plants in Illinois buying credits from farmers in the Dakotas, in Iowa, Nebraska, wherever they might need those CI scores. Likewise, we think that potentially a mass balance system can have you be captured, if you will, knowing that you've got some relatively small draw areas. If you're limited on your markets and an ethanol plant is your primary market, you kind of become captured and get a little bit into a position where you need to do what they're asking. We have seen this. It was a hypothetical when we were drafting some comments earlier this spring and are seeing it play out with ADM and their deforestation-free soybeans. Great program. I think that most of our farmers have no problem meeting that. However, we're aware of several facilities, ADM facilities, that have said, if you don't sign up for our deforestation-free soybean program, we're not going to buy your soybeans. That makes us very nervous on that this could happen for 45Z with your corn as well. And we want to make sure that this is voluntary, that it's your choice if you want to engage in these practices and go after some of this incentive that's out there. And finally, the thought again, I missed this a minute ago, I apologize, but thinking about our CI score and the yield driver, which I think actually we'll bring it up next with this. Knowing that a CI score is so dependent on yield, there's a question that's raised. What happens if you've done everything in your power? You've gone to manure, you're using cover crops, you're at a strip till or no-till situation, you're doing everything you can, and you're expecting 280 bushel corn. All of a sudden, there's a derecho, a hailstorm, another weather event, another act of God, and now you're sitting at 140. Your CI score is going to tank. And so the question remains then, A, what happens to you in this investment you've made? But more so, if this is tied to the bushel of grain, it's really going to limit an ethanol producer in that draw region if enough of the corn is damaged there to be able to participate. So that book and claim also gives the ability to, again, source these needed low CI feedstock from wherever they might be in existence. Stackability. So thinking about, there's a lot of programs out there today. The USDA Partnership for Climate Smart Commodity Grants, there's a few $1 billion floating around and really starting to come out this last year with programs. ADM's got a program, Cargill's got a program, PepsiCo has a program. There's lots of programs out there. How is this going to work? Well, the big question is someone claiming your carbon, and who is it, and how are, and what is the parameters with that? So I would tell you that most of these climate smart commodity grant projects are claiming your carbon, your greenhouse gas footprint, your environmental impact. If that is the case, I would say you're going to be very unlikely to then sell your grain into a 45Z market because that CI reduction has already been claimed. Now, if you're doing a traditional NRCS CSP EQIP program, I would say you're probably fine. Those programs are paying you for that practice and for a very different outcome. They want to hold soil, they want to reduce soil erosion, they're looking at some other long-term benefits, but NRCS is not claiming any type of carbon or GHG benefit. So knowing what you're actually being paid for, the programs you're enrolled in, is going to be very important going forward. Other things, record keeping, certification, verification. These are all things we're waiting to find out as well. What is the burden on the farmer? Who is going to be the person that's going to verify and certify these bushels, whether it is bushels or, knowing that if we're going to go into this token or credit market, what does that look like? Who are the aggregators? How does this work into the system? One last thing, I know I just want to bring this or go back to this mass balance book and claim thing one more time, knowing we have a wide variety of audience members today, some that might not be as familiar with grain flow. I think about it this way. Non-GMO corn, white corn, hard endo, there are physical and functional differences to those products. Yellow number 2 corn grown with climate smart practices has no physical or functional difference from yellow number 2 corn that doesn't. So I think about taking 2 boxes of Rice Krispies, dumping them together, and asking you to sort those Rice Krispies back into the respective boxes. It's impossible. And that's the thing with the flow of grain, and that a lot of people don't realize is how quickly that grain is intermingled and there is no way to tell it apart. And so I think, again, we really need to be thinking through, how does this look? What is going to put the least amount of burden on the farm gate and the farm level? So with that, I will turn things over to Matt.
Well, thank you for that, Megan. That was really, really nice setup for what I'm going to talk about. Am I able to control the slides?
I don't know. Let me, hold on. I think I'd have to change you to the presenter, so I don't think so. I will click ahead if you don't mind.
Okay, if you want to just go to the next slide. So today Megan really did a nice job of covering the highlights of 45Z. I'm going to give you a little bit more background on the climate smart ag provisions in 40B. And I'm also going to talk to you about the carbon intensity scores of soybeans and where they come from, and maybe potentially the lack of options that we have on this side. So what I have here to start off with is a chart from one of the most recent Argonne National Lab publications. So this is the same group that Megan mentioned that runs the GREET model. Every time they update one of these biofuel pathways, as we call them, starting with feedstock going to fuel, they generally publish an academic paper, which is nice because then we know all the inputs, all their assumptions behind this. What I've got on the left side of the chart here is basically the carbon intensity for the 3 dominant oil seeds, or at least 2 dominant oil seeds, and Carinata, which the company's trying to commercialize. This is in that same grams per megajoule unit that Megan talked about. So where Megan talked about corn being 29, you can see soybeans is pretty low. It's less than 10. Canola is much higher, carinata is much higher, and you see those CIs being driven by that light gray bar and that light blue bar, which is fertilizer. So just like corn, these oil seeds that require nitrogen, they also, have a higher CI. Soybeans being a legume, much lower CI. However, there are still emissions from nitrogen, and those are the primary source, according to Argonne National Lab, of emissions. Now you may be thinking, I don't put 200 pounds of nitrogen down on my soybeans. Where is this coming from? Basically, what Argonne assumes in the model is that there's a significant amount of N that's wrapped up in the plant matter itself. And so when the biomass decomposes in the field in fall and spring, that's releasing and creating some nitrogen emissions, and those are highly potent greenhouse gases. Why is that kind of a problem? That's a problem because, like Megan kind of teed up, in the corn side, if you wanted to reduce your emissions from nitrogen, you could either back your rate off, potentially try a different product, try a green alternative. Here on the soybean side, we don't really have that option, right? This is just the physiology of the plant. So that puts us in a position where these climate smart ag practices become really important, because we have to think about ways to effectively offset those through things like building soil organic carbon. So that's one challenge. On the right side, this looks just a little bit at the fuel production emissions. You can see that renewable diesels are really heavy with the hydrogen demand. It'll be the same thing for sustainable aviation fuel. The big CI component of making these fuels will be sourcing hydrogen. You can go to the next slide, Megan. I'm just going to touch on this one quick. This is that same basically bar chart for soy broken out into a much more detailed pie. And so you can see on that left pie chart, that big green 69%, those are your nitrogen emissions. You as a farmer and the soybean system have very little control over this. You can see other minor components that you would have control over, yellow slice being notable. That's things like diesel fuel that could potentially be reduced by using things like biodiesel. But otherwise, the soybean system, it's relatively low input, relatively low emission from a user standpoint, from a human creation standpoint, but we've got this nitrogen challenge that we have to manage. And this is something that United Soybean Board, the National Checkoff, has been doing a lot of academic work around, a lot of flux and greenhouse gas sensing tests. We at Iowa Soybean and with Iowa State are doing a lot of work to actually understand if some of this might be influenced by the corn system a little bit, to be frank. We're trying to understand if some of the residual biomass that's left over, that's decomposing the following year, is basically being picked up on our side. And so there's a question of, could greater residue management actually lead to lower N2O emissions for both the corn and soybean system? And that's being done with Mike Castellato at Iowa State. I'll go to the next slide, Megan. This just at a high level, Megan hit on a lot of this. This kind of covers these climate smart ag practices that were released as 40B. One thing I'd add to Megan's comments that NRCS shared with us maybe a couple of months ago when we went out there. 40B is not great, right? Like Megan laid out all the challenges with bundling and contracting and et cetera. And senior staff at NRCS just said, like, hey, we know it's not great, but we were effectively in a position where we wanted to build a climate smart ag program for 45Z, but we had no regulation, if you will, or no basically foundation to build off of. And so to build a more long-standing program in their mind for 45Z, they had to just, like, in my words, kind of puke something out. They had to like put a document out with some type of like framework to the industry to comment on, and that is what 40B is. And they knew, USDA specifically, they knew that this wasn't going to be the best design, but it was like what they could, the sausage that they could make in that internal working group in the time they had. And so now the challenge, like Megan articulated, for all of us in the ag industry on the checkoff side is to try to improve this thing for 45Z going forward. And that's what we've been trying to do through the RFI process and the meetings in DC. Couple other things I would point out that just to add on to what Megan mentioned. One benefit I'd say, I agree with her that book and claim is ideal. One benefit that they have right now in the mass balance system for the supply chain themselves is you can roll that grain basically on paper indefinitely. So unlike other programs where there's a vintage and the climate smart attributes expire, that isn't written in 40B. So I would expect that would stay in even if they went to a mass balance. One other big win I would say for the farmers in general, for the farm side on this, is there's no additionality requirement like there is with a lot of other programs. So if you've been doing something for a long time and you want to participate in this, nothing says it's going to stop you. One of the questions that we asked and wanted a little bit more clarification on is their no-till strip-till requirement effectively has a soil tillage intensity rating under 20. Our question to them was, is that just an STIR for the tillage event itself, or is that an STIR for the whole season, right? Because even running a combine over a field generates an STIR number, which is admittedly small, but we're thinking about things like in Iowa, knifing in hog manure and the disturbance that that might create, as well as trying to manage other passes across the field. On the cover crop or on the cover crop piece, like Megan said, the practice standard is challenging. Kind of the one asterisk I'd have in there, but they also include is manage consistent with your local NRCS recommendation. So we have some farmers who are like really interested in that because they're like, oh, my local NRCS guy says a cover crop is winter killed oats, and so they're thinking like I could just get away with planting oats potentially, but that's again, those devils are in the detail, and that's the stuff that we just don't know from final guidance. Megan touched on the nutrient piece. We have a lot of farmers asking, like, what about manure? Manure is a tool, a lever in the calculator, but it's not included. We've also heard that the agency and Argonne may be considering adding in digestate or humus, which is basically the residual manure or crop residue product that would come out of an anaerobic digester. That has nutrient value. It's a little bit more stable, but it's just not available. So it's something that it would be great that they include it, but they really need to include manure as well. And then like Megan hit, very few practices included in GREET. And this is a big challenge that I think we've all got to recognize that, up until 5 or 6 years ago, Argonne did ag, but they only did ag as like a very basic input into the biofuels model. So it wasn't until 5 or 6 years ago that groups really started to pressure them and saying, like, if you guys are going to be the leaders in calculating carbon footprint for biofuels, you got to do more to calculate and include what's going on the farm at a more granular level instead of just having this one national average number for corn and soybeans that they've had for 20 years. That's, frankly, if we're being honest, that's created some challenges, right? These are a bunch of chemical and mechanical engineers that are having to think about the biology of the ag world. They worked really well with USDA, but they're going to have to rely on tools like FDCIC is built upon things like Common Farm. So they're going to have to rely on those existing USDA tools and those existing USDA management practices and figure out how to basically calculate the benefits from there and bring it over into the GREET model. And that's just going to be something that's going to be challenging, I think, going on, especially as they continue to try to update this. I'll have you go to the next slide, Megan. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the structure of the tax credit. I think Megan touched a lot on this, but under 45Z, you've got differential payment rates for aviation fuel and on-road fuel. The way that I like to think about this is every 1 CI point for a gallon of ethanol or biodiesel or even renewable diesel is worth about 2 cents a gallon. And for SAF, it's about 3.5 cents a gallon. And so you automatically would think that, like, hey, making SAF is going to make the whole system more profitable. And like, kind of yes, to an extent, because the ethanol has a greater subsidy rate per gallon. But if you go to the next slide, there's some interesting things that you'll start to realize from the farmer side. Because at the end of the day, the way that this 40B credit was set up, and I know this is probably an eye chart, so I'll leave Megan with the slides to distribute out to the farmers on the other side. And I want to put a big caveat that this is math like back of the envelope spreadsheet math. So please don't take this to the bank. But I'm pretty confident that it's indicative of kind of where this market's going. But the point I want to make here, if you look at kind of the second to the bottom line here, what I've done is I've said, like, what are those 10 CI points a farmer might receive, like If a farmer received 100% of the value back, like what could that potentially be worth? And you notice that ethanol comes to about $125 an acre. I get to about 105 for SAF. Again, probably not perfect. But why that's really interesting to me is if you think about that slide previously where ethanol has a 2 cent per gallon payment rate and SAF has a 3.5 cent per gallon payment rate, you think, wow, well, the farmer should be receiving a lot more. There should be a lot more value on the SAF side. Well, in theory, yes, but it all comes back to how efficient was that fuel producer? How efficient was that biorefinery at turning your corn or soybeans into fuel? Because they're getting paid on how many gallons of fuel they make, how many megajoules of fuel they make, not how many bushels of corn they grind or what your yield is. And so when you think about an SAF plant, they're taking a perfectly good gallon of ethanol and then they're converting multiple perfectly good gallons of ethanol into a single gallon of aviation fuel. And so that, effectively results in some yield loss that they're going to have to consider. Now, I'll admit on the SAF side, I don't have the co-products included here, and that will add significant value back. The one other thing I think that's important to think about from a farmer standpoint is, as Megan described, there's going to be this contracting relationship between the farmer and the SAF producer likely. If I'm just picking on somebody here, like if I'm Gevo and I'm going to raise $1 billion to go build an SAF plant, I'm going to have lenders who are going to want to be paid back. And I'm probably going to be thinking about every revenue and margin stream that I have in my revenue cube to try to get at so that I have enough margin to pay my lenders back. That includes the climate smart ag value that farmers are generating, right? Because they're generating that value, they're kind of in that position to share with you back, kind of what you're willing to take. So you've got an SAF producer who has a lot of debt. I would imagine that they're going to need more of that revenue than, say, a fully depreciated ethanol plant that's been sitting there for 20 years and doesn't have, $600–700 million of debt to pay back. They may be in a position to pay farmers more actually for those climate smart attributes. So if I can go to the next slide quick. Same slide, basically, just wanted to touch on soybeans here. I've got 3 columns here: biodiesel, renewable diesel, and SAF. The BD and RD both use that on-road value. The SAF is the higher rate. But the big thing you notice here is that second to the bottom row is the number here is a fraction of what you see on the corn side. It's, literally 10%. And you're probably scratching your head saying, what's going on here? Well, it all really comes back to yield. I mean, so if we use some round numbers here, if you grow 200 bushel corn, and we'll say we have a magic ethanol plant that's making 3 bushels or 3 gallons a bushel, making 600 bushel or 600 gallons. That's a lot of gallons per acre. On the soybean side, you might yield, 100 gallons, 90 gallons of soybean oil-based biofuel an acre. At the same time, the carbon credit or the 40B climate smart ag is 5 points instead of 10 points. So you're basically producing 1/6 of the amount of gallons, and you're getting half the amount of CI value for those same practices. And so this is a really, really huge challenge for us, because if you go back to like my second or third slide where I'm talking about the carbon intensity, really the only way that we have to get closer to zero is to do things like cover crops and reduce tillage to build that SOC and offset the N2O emissions. But the credit just is not set up to pay for soybeans. It's really set up to pay on yield. So I think, like Megan said, we're going to have to really think about on the soybean side of being creative and how to combine things like existing NRCS practices, or excuse me, USDA programs. I mean, we're leading an $25 million RCPP right now to try to basically combine a $70 payment rate along with a climate smart attribute to get farmers to implement these things in Northern Iowa. So that'll be a challenge. And just one last slide that I'll cover on the conclusion slide from my standpoint. The climate smart ag CI reduction is a huge problem for soy. It's not going to cover the practice cost. And this is driven by that per gallon incentive structure I just described. Megan hit on this, but I think one of the most important things for farmers is who holds what liability for how long. This is a huge question. And then, I think something that Iowa soybean is pretty firmly set on right now is farmers should not be paying for a CI score. We just don't know what's going to happen. Like Megan said, there will be some aspects that of 40B that will carry over to 45Z. Those are things like, what's the emissions related to your nitrogen? What's the emissions related to your diesel fuel? Kind of those things that you have control over, those direct inputs, the energy and chemical inputs, we have a lot of certainty in those. What we have no idea on, and nobody can tell you, is what's the value of a prairie strip? What's the value of some of these? I wouldn't even say that the cover crop one is appropriate. The 10 points is appropriate for ethanol. So what we have told folks, and I'll fully admit this is our bias, right, is we connect them with a group that we founded in the state called the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. And it's a group, everybody has their favorite group, whether it's Indigo or whoever. We like SWAF. We created it. It was run by the Checkoff. It's a private company now. But why I like it is because they can help you understand the value of your carbon, whether you're selling it to a CPG company like Nestle or Cargill or PepsiCo, or they can also help you understand what it would be for the biofuel market in that same area. So you're not tied to a specific thing, and they set it up where you own the attributes as Megan described, so you have the choice on when, how to market those. So that's my only sales pitch for today. And I appreciate you guys letting the soybean guy come on and hang out with corn growers for a day.
Great, Matt. I've got some similar concluding points, and then please, guys, if you've got questions, throw them in the chat or the question box. So similarly, ask a lot of questions. Not only who is going to have access to your data, what can they do with them? Are they the only entity? I've heard of several groups that you are giving your data to them, but then they also have another third-party verifier beyond that. So your data is leaving the entity you've maybe made that agreement with. Well, what are they going to do with it? How long are they going to have this sitting on their system? If they are perceived and potentially become an approved verifier, one would think for IRS and auditing purposes, they're going to have to keep that for a few years. So really knowing what is happening with that. Likewise, what are your contractual obligations? Are you being committed today to, are you talking about signing up bushels? Are you talking about signing up so many CI points? What does that look like? What are their commitments to you back? Are they guaranteeing you a certain percent or dollar amount or value? Really being clear on what all of those terms are. Again, Matt did a great job of talking about this too. There are so few things we know today. So what happens if you enter in this agreement, the rules come out and they are not at all what was perceived and the assumptions were? Where does that leave you? Is your contract void? Do you pivot? Are you, pivoting to their new terms? So many things out there that we just do not know. Matt mentioned SWAF. Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, great program. Illinois, another great program is our PCM, Precision Conservation Management. Similar setup with the multiple climate smart commodity grants and relationships with PepsiCo, Kentucky Distillers Association, another free resource that really looks at your farm operation and helps you muddle through and see through what are the environmental returns, what is the value to doing this, what are your costs to doing this. So there are some really great resources that, to Matt's point, were developed by farmer organizations for the best interests of the farmer. So recommend, maybe starting in one of those places to put your toes in and get a better handle on what's going on. Likewise, I think, again, we talked about this, with this being a tax credit that would go on obviously at the end of a tax year, when you might see, payments. If a farmer asked me today, what should I do? I think my advice would be, there are programs like SWAF, PCM that can guarantee you a payment for 2024, what you've done. What's the harm in entering into that? It's an annual commitment, your 24 crop. Let the rules come out in 25, have your grain positioned to be in that 25 market, have a little more certainty without waiting for that financial stream to come in 26 or beyond. Again, you need to do what you're comfortable with and know what you're after and what you're trying to achieve on your own farm. But I just think that knowing what's in front of you, what's a guarantee versus these big questions, can be a little uncomfortable and cause some confusion and a little bit of panic. And finally, robust record keeping. It's never too early to start keeping some really good records at the farm level, field level. What are those inputs? How are they being distributed? And being ready to try and enter into this whenever it comes. So with that, you've got Matt and my email addresses. We'd be happy to have some follow-ups offline if there are questions. Again, feel free to throw some stuff in the chat. I haven't seen anything pop up yet. Did have some questions come in prior to this that I think are good and worth talking about. You know, a question, do you get a score by the field or by your farm? I think that's a great question. I think we would advocate that a field level score gives you more power, more control. We all know that the same practices don't happen field to field. You know, tillage is probably fairly consistent. But you might not have manure on every acre. You might not have cover crops on every acre. And so as we learn and identify what practices are even going to be included, those field scores really could have a major influence. For ease and for accountability, absolutely, a farm or operation level score makes sense for some of these folks on the other side of the table. They don't have to worry about keeping those records separate and whatever. You've got one score. So that's something that's to be determined. But again, thinking about your value proposition, and if you're going to have to lump all that together. Talking about the yield piece in this, I asked USDA last week that exact question about the yield failure, what happens? And I got an interesting pushback was, well, who says we're even using the current year's yield to calculate the CI score? So that opens up some additional questions on if we start thinking about APHs and other things out there. So just, again, there are just so many things that we don't know today. You know, a question around, do I have to haul to an ethanol plant or deliver the grain directly? I would say that we know a lot of ethanol plants, biodiesel plants are contracting through elevators. So to make that a direct delivery would be very complicated. We think that the elevators are absolutely going to have some role in this system. Matt, I don't know, I'll offer this one to you. Who collects this data? Like, what is the data collection piece on anything today that we know?
So right now, I mean, we've got some programs. One example is you've got an ethanol plant in Illinois that does some contracting work directly with farmers and collects a lot of the similar data. They're using it so that they can access foreign markets and to be able to export their ethanol. The way that group would do it, or the ways that I've seen in the state, is they either have employees that are like a technical service provider. Maybe they're not an official TSP, but there's some type of technical assistance out in the field. They might be helping a farmer implement that practice if we're lucky. You know, at a minimum, they're going to be helping them collect that data. And then those groups, as far as their audit requirements, they usually have to go through a pretty intensive desk paper audit of, you know, like, is their processes at the ethanol plant, for example, up to snuff? But then, generally speaking, they take a square root sample size of farmers. And so then you'll have, you know, if you're one of the lucky selected, could have auditors show up at your farm, you know, and asking you for information. Groups that have done that generally have some type of payment clause related to that in their contract that says, like, hey, you farmer, if you get selected for an in-person audit, you know, we're going to write you a $500 check or a $1,000 check because you're going to waste an entire day dealing with somebody who doesn't really know about agriculture, just coming out to ask you a bunch of questions. So it depends how it's going to work in this 45Z system. Who knows? I mean, you mentioned elevators. I mean, this is one of the things that we're freaking out on the soy side about, quite frankly. And we look at the corn ethanol side with a little bit of envy, in the sense that you guys just generally take direct delivery of corn, you know, for these ethanol plants. You know, for a biodiesel plant, generally, or especially a renewable diesel plant in SAF, there's always going to be a crush facility that's separately located. There's likely going to be an elevator that's located and a shuttle terminal too. And so when you talk about the mass balance approach, one of the other challenges that introduces is, on the soy side, we've only got $20 an acre to play with at most. And you're talking about having 3 or 4 mouths to feed in the supply chain between the farmer and the ultimate fuel producer. So that's a huge challenge too that we've all got to grapple with.
Great. Another one for you. What's the likelihood of a farmer receiving a premium-based payment on a CI score in 25 or 26?
So the likelihood of any one farmer receiving it is high, right? Like, and I kind of say that tongue in cheek. I've met 2 farmers so far in the entire state of Iowa who last year did all 3 practices. So they would qualify. Neither are even close to an ethanol plant though. So they wouldn't actually be able to monetize it. Um, so look, I'm sorry, I'm not going to kind of directly answer your question, because I think big picture, what I see here is we've got these 45Z requirements or options, incentives that are coming down the pike. I'm sure your growers are aware here that California is proposing to do map and track essentially of acres starting in the next few years. Canada is effectively turned their program on now that requires field boundaries and will eventually allow hopefully something like 45Z. So what I really want to highlight to folks is it's not like, is the 45Z going to be an opportunity or the year or two? It's like, if you are in an ethanol producer standpoint or a biofuel producer standpoint, you want marketing options. You want to be able to sell to any market that you can physically access and get the highest premium that it can be. And it may blow your mind to think that biofuel, we're trading to Europe today, we're trading to Japan, Canada, California. And so optionality is value to them. And so from my standpoint, the way that a farmer can position themselves to be the most valuable supplier or kind of be ahead of the curve here is kind of exactly what you said, is like, what data can you start to collect today and get organized? Because outside of, say, tracking what's going on the farm, like that field boundary data, we know is going to be immediately valuable. ADM you mentioned with the deforestation regulation. We're seeing companies pay a premium for it in Iowa just so that they can sell the soybean oil to a renewable diesel producer who wants to sell that renewable diesel to Canada next year. So I feel like we're going to see this escalation in data requirements in potential value, but that's all going to be the balance that we're going to have to figure out over the next 2 to 3 years.
I agree. Well, I've had no other questions come in, so we must have done that amazing of a job hitting everybody's wanting to know items for this morning. As a reminder, this has been recorded. We will get the posting shared and the link out to attendees, as well as getting it shared more broadly. Thank you everyone for your time this morning. Wishing everyone a safe and bountiful harvest as we move into that season. And feel free to reach out again, corn, soybean growers, your associations that are really keeping a close eye on what's developing and engaging these conversations. A side note, if you're interested in engaging more, USDA is hosting 3 stakeholder virtual meetings coming up October 1st, 8th, and 15th, I believe. You can register to join. If you want to provide your own comments, you can publicly do so as well. So yeah, stay tuned and thank you for joining.